one of the great things about session-based training, like 2 or 3 days a week, is if you don't come in, you lose your session. So like a lot of people are like, I'm not losing my damn session off. Well, if that's enough to get you out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning, then we're going to use it, right?
You're a dad, right?
Yeah.
Yep. So my kids, anytime I'll we'll be eating dinner, we'll be out, we'll do something. And, a lot of times if I say something, it is a dad joke and it's not intentional. Yeah, I think it's funny. They don't think it's funny, right? They're not laughing. But I always tell them just keep that in your back pocket, 10, 20 years down the road. It'll be
You're
good.
going to want this.
Yeah, you're going to want this stuff.
That's right.
It's good material.
It is. I mean, ours are so bad and so dumb, but it's just, I find them hilarious. And you've probably seen the videos of like the 2 guys on the dock that just sit there in goofy clothes and tell each other dad jokes and try not to laugh. It's like, I thought about doing a whole, since it's become like a thing with us now, I thought about shooting one similar where we're just in like cheesy workout wear, like sitting in the gym, just going back and forth telling dad jokes. We could make a whole series out of that. It'd be so silly, but it would be good. So anyway,
it'd be fun too, man.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of our core values is humor with a touch of crazy. So it's like, look, if we can't display that, and if somebody listens to the podcast and they're like, there's a lot of good content in there, don't get me wrong, we get down to business, but at the same time, if they start and they're like, these guys telling dad, I can't do this. It's like, well, you're not going to fit in our system very well. If you take yourself that seriously, you're probably not going to be a good franchise partner. And so that's why we do it. And people that like it, and they fit in really well.
You were voted as the fastest growing franchise.
Yeah. Fitness. Yeah. Well, it was in the last quarter of 23, we were the fastest growing fitness franchise in the world. And that was just based on number of licenses awarded. So we were moving, that's for sure, and still are. We are up almost 200% in licenses awarded in this first quarter over last year in this quarter. So couldn't be doing any better, to be honest.
So you've been on the show before. I love having you here. I always gain good insights, good material. So some of the stuff I wanted to dive into today was really about how you build into group fitness or small group training, because some of these other brands, some of these other franchises, I just had this conversation last week with a lady who bought into a different franchise. Her frustration, she's been doing it for 5 years. Her frustration was that she got into this thinking that she was going to get all this support. She was going to get kind of the turnkey solution, so to speak. I mean, that's the whole point of franchising. McDonald's went out there, they kicked this thing off, right? Take you through McDonald's University or Hamburger University. And all of a sudden you have the tools that you need to go ahead and be a business owner, a business operator. She was frustrated because she's been operating for 5 years and the tools that she was given was not what she really needed to do well. And so she had to go out and hire an outside business coach to help her grow her business. They're not a boutique. They aren't just offering one service. So how do you compete against that? And then how do you support your franchisees to compete against that?
When we considered going to franchising, we were running a multi-service, multi-vertical business corporately. So we had everything, Michael, from one-on-one training to personal training in a small group, which has always been our special sauce and our line item of revenue that produced the most revenue of all, because it was a good value proposition for personal training. We did large groups like boot camp style, and we did virtual. So we had 4 different verticals of training. So when we looked at going to franchising, I knew from my experience in working with other large franchisors that it needed to be dead simple. So we really just looked at, we were in 2,500 door fronts, by the way, at the time, from India to Dubai, everywhere in between. So it's like, okay, where is there a real gap in the market? And do we have the right machine built to fit into that gap? And it turns out there was a gap for the customer avatar that would typically buy personal training, which we would describe that as sort of 45 to 65. Mm-hmm. Yes, we can go younger. Yes, we have older, but that's sort of the sweet spot. And so when you look at that customer avatar, people over 50 hold 70% of the nation's disposable income. Not a bad market to chase with a high-end service, right? So then it's like, all right, well, do we have the mechanisms built to service this crowd? And the answer was yes. I mean, we've been doing personal training since 1992. Sure, the first 10 years were in a one-on-one setting, and then we moved that, all of that business, 3,000 one-on-one sessions a month. We moved that to personal training in a small group, which by our definition is up to 6 people. And we knew in franchising, scale alone makes things complicated. And so we need to keep it dead simple. So there's a gap in the market. We have the right machine built. We've been doing just small group personal training since the early 2000s. So
Mm-hmm.
24, 23 years. Great. That's scalable and it's simple, meaning we can open a very small footprint, have very few clients paying more than you would in, say, a class-based model, and do really well. We can give people return on investment if they run the model right. And it was something that we knew really well. We had been working with that particular vertical with great success for a long period of time. We even opened a couple of pilot facilities corporately, tested the model, put people in there to run them with different levels of business acumen so we would know who we could actually sell it to, like who can actually run one of these, right? So we did a lot of work. I mean, I think it took us almost 30 years to even get to franchising. So it's not like we did it quickly.
Right.
So when you look at that, it's like it's easy to defend. If you think about going into a crowded fitness market, which there's a lot of fitness in franchising, like food, there's a lot of food in franchising as
Mm-hmm.
well. And sometimes you get the impression when we first started where it was like, oh, another fitness franchise. But then when you really start to describe what we do and how we do it, and there's no one in the franchise space who's servicing it the way that we are yet. I'm sure based on our early success, we're going to have the Pepsi to our Coke, and that's fine while we're ready. But not only, it needed to be dead simple. There was a gap in the market. All the things lined up, and it needed to be dead simple. So it needed to be just the one service, right? So we could just have one coach on the floor with up to 6 clients at any given time and still meet the brand promise of personal training. And then when you look at that customer avatar, that affected real estate choices and pricing modules and all the things that came with it that we had been doing at scale through both licensing and our corporately owned gyms for a long period of time. So yes, it's easy to differentiate. I'm happy to go into a crowded fitness market, and a really healthy model for us is 100, even 100 people in some markets up to 130, and a max is around 150. So it's like, okay, can we gobble up 130 people in these local markets that just don't have the right flavor for them, in the market? And the answer is yes, they're everywhere. They might be paying $200 an hour working out with a trainer in an Equinox, right, in that market. Or
Right.
they might be doing a boot camp based model, but they've got a bum knee and they just can't run on the treadmill. So say an OTF isn't working for them anymore. So what did they do, right? And so we're confident that we can go into those markets and drum up 130 people. Our retention in our model, really does much better than the industry standard. So we can keep them. So you ramp and hold, which is nice. And then as far as support, this is going to sound silly because it's going to sound like a job interview where you're like, what would you say is one of your biggest downfalls? And they're like, well, I'm a perfectionist. I work too hard. It's kind of
Right.
that kind of idea where you kind of chuckle like, okay, it's a canned answer. But it was similar with us. It's going to sound the same, where I would say early on we provided too much support. So we do everything from
Mm-hmm.
going into their local markets once we once we award them a franchise. We send real estate groups in to find their space. We help them negotiate the LOI. We then help negotiate the lease, and in there's like people in insurance reviewing the lease, attorneys reviewing the lease, all the things. So we're helping with all of that. And then we've got a pre-sale where we're coaching them pre-sale. And at the time, we even had a pre-sale hit team that you could hire that would do your phone sales during your pre-sale on your
Mm.
behalf, and all
You
of
still
these
doing that?
assets. No, and I'll tell you why. And I'm going to get to the long-winded point was I think we were providing so much support that it didn't really allow the franchisee to learn to make the sausage. So in other words, we would
Mm-hmm.
basically run the whole thing for you, and it would be almost like having a baby, not having to birth it. And then someone just like stands there and reaches out with
Right.
both arms and like, here's the baby. And you're like, I don't know. I didn't
Right.
do anything with it. Like, how did this even get here? Like, what do you mean now's the baby? I'm like, yeah, we don't run the whole business forever.
Yeah.
And I knew that we were providing in some ways, sounds silly, but too much support when we would get feedback like, hey, can't you guys send people over here to train our clients? I'm like, no, that's your business, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we've built you the perfect bicycle. Now you have to get on the bicycle and pedal it, right? I think that's a good analogy. So I would say that we provide a ton of support. And I would say one of our downfalls early on was creating unrealistic expectations by providing too much support. I know it sounds silly. Again, it's like the job interview where I usually work too hard, and you're like, okay, whatever.
Right.
But really, I mean, if you ask me now, what was our biggest mistake? It was that we set crazy, unrealistic expectations because we did way too much for franchisees, and they loved it until it was time for them to take over. And we hadn't given them the skills or the right lenses or the things to do it because we were doing it all for them. Right. So I think there's a fine line between, I've talked to, as you have, Michael, you talk to a lot of people in the industry. You've been in it for a while. You know the space really well. You talk to some people and they're like, you mean you help people find real estate? I'm like, yeah, they don't do that for you. So, I mean, I'm shocked at sometimes the lack of support, but you can also, through our experience, provide too much support. So I think there's a fine line. There's a nice area in between there where the rubber meets the road where you need to hang out. So it's your business, but we're going to give you all the tools you need to be successful.
As you know, I had a personal training business with a lot of locations. Our lifetime with a customer was usually around 6 months. I mean, we had some customers obviously stay longer. Some would be with us from the day that we started. They'd be there for 10 years. But majority of people, they were there for 6 months. So we knew the plateau point, right? We knew when we needed to have another lift. And we had the same thing with our coaches, right? Because that's the balance. You can have the process, you can have the product, you can have all those systems in place, and obviously you've been able to replicate it and it's great. But then you get into people, and that's the challenge. So for us, we knew that we would have that 6 month period and then we had to have a lift, but we also knew that our trainers, the coaches that were working with these clients, they'd last maybe 18, which was actually pretty high. We had an 18-month window for coaches. I think in the industry, it's like 6 to 9 months. First of all, what is that lifespan for a client? So those listening, they go, okay, now I know what I'm getting into.
We often talk about the average lifespan of a customer in our corporate facilities is 3 years, so 36 months. Now, if you look at our franchise, it's a bit early innings to tell. We opened our first club during COVID in 2020, and they've maintained around 96% retention.
Wow.
So they're only churning out 4% a month. And of 130 people,
that's great.
Not a lot of people each month. Yeah. So yeah, your marketing spend is nil at that point. Some of our other franchisees have turned out more than that, maybe operationally if they struggle, to get the right people in the right seats. As you know, that you just mentioned, that's the key. And so our retention is really good. It's too early to know what the average lifespan is of a customer, but what we're seeing is to get those people that are going to stay 3 years, especially after a grand opening, it's probably going to take 6 to 9 months for the dust to settle. You might land that top 80 to 100 that are going to stick right off the bat for 3 years, but I think it's unrealistic to say we're going to sell 130 memberships to a family of people that's going to stay with us for the next 3 years. Like, you're going to miss on some. It's not their cup of tea. They move. I mean, things happen. Then the dust settles, and then you keep growing. And then around that 6 to 9 month point, you stabilize. And those are the people you're going to stick with for a long period of time. So we anticipate it being similar for franchisees. It's just too early innings to know because most of our clubs have been open the longest for like 2 years at this point. So, and they're doing well, but I can't tell you how many years because there's people that are still there, and we'll have to run the averages on that. So far, so good.
What about the coaches?
Yeah, that one's been interesting. So, we provide a lot of tools. I think if you just zoom out and say, okay, like, how do we identify the right people? It's like, okay, what's going to make people stay? It's like, okay, we'll pay, first of all, right? And then we run EOS, and through the EOS system, there is a criteria checking boxes through core values, and it's called GWC, which essentially stands for gets it, wants it, has the capacity to do it, right? So we can make a relevant offer that beats the market pay. And I think you start with that, you're in a pretty good spot. You're going to be able to attract better talent if you can pay more. I think that's underestimated for most people. It's like, oh, it's cool here. I'm nice. And that's all great. But like, people have to pay their bills, right? So if you can pay better than market rate and you can do guaranteed pay, like salaries and pay time off and benefits and all the things that we have procured on behalf of our franchisees that they can grab and then take to market, you're going to find, better people. And then through the lens of gets it, wants it, has the capacity to do it, we have a screening test that we provide to franchisees that they can use as well. And it's specific to the positions in Alloy because, as you know, Michael, sometimes you hire people and they look really good on paper, and then you put them into a specific role, and maybe they're a great coach and they do good selling, say, in person, but you put them into a role where they have to like get people to the gym, which means they have to get on the phone and do follow up and hear no a lot, which can be
Right.
demoralizing if you're not wired the right way. Then they're not good in that position, right? So we have a screening test because we want to not only put the right people on the bus, but we want to make sure they're in the right seats. And it's really only a few, I mean, it's only 3 employees typically, right? You've got your director, you're a full-time coach, and a part-timer, maybe 2 part-timers, depending on how part-time they are. And so making sure, first of all, we can pay more than average, right? And they actually have capacity to do the job, because obviously it doesn't take much to, to understand how if they couldn't do the job and you were holding them accountable to something they weren't hardwired to do, it's going to be an uphill battle and you're going to lose them. So if you do those two things, retention has been pretty good. So, again, it's all leadership. Boy, when we get on these calls for potential franchisees, first question I ask them, we have something called a founders call, which is the gatekeeping call to get to what we call discovery day, which is the last sort of double vetting, event in the process of awarding a franchise. And I'll ask them, tell me about your leadership experience, because their ability to attract, hire, and lead really good people is going to be the crux move of this whole business. And I know you're nodding your head because you've scaled a large personal training business and done really well with it. The people are the key. And so if we can have a vendor to help you identify them, we can offer, you'll be able to offer a better than market rate comp package with benefits and everything. Great. Here's a screening test to make sure they're hardwired to do the thing you're asking them to do, because that won't work if they're not. And then lastly, here's how you interview them, right? Based on our core values. It's giving you the best chance of success. So if you do all of that, I don't know what the average is. To your point, I used to sit on the board for ACE, which is American Council on Exercise. And the average stay for most personal trainers, just on average, and it didn't give the environment necessarily, but it was under a year, right?
Right.
And we've got a lot of clubs that are keeping coaches for longer than that thus far. But again, it's so early innings. I don't know what the average stay of a part-time trainer, as an example, in an Alloy is going to be. We would obviously assume part-time would be less stable than like a full-time salaried position with benefits, right? But I don't know yet. As far as directors and head coaches, they tend to stick around because the comp's pretty good and the job role is not awful. It's again, you're in the director position. You've probably sat in seats or coached people in seats where it's 99% sales, because you've got a lot of churn on the back end of these, class-based models. You got to sell 60 memberships a month and net grow by 15 because you're churning out, 30, 45 on the back end. It's like, that's a racket. And you're basically a salesperson that just happens to sell fitness. Well, if you're only churning out 4%, and you're only having to sell like 5 or 6 a month, you're really doing fitness mostly, right? You're just taking care of the flock, and you can ask for referrals and fill up your gym that way. That's a much better environment. So you're going to keep people around longer if they just get to do fitness and they're not basically just full-time sales. So it's a lot of words, but I hope that helps you understand like the landscape. And I don't have a concrete answer for you thus far, unfortunately, but we'll see. We're anticipating it being better than the industry average, better than that 12 months, but we'll see.
Well, I think, there's a lot that you said there. And there's a lot
I did say a lot.
But there's a lot of material there on exactly how this thing, to your point, I mean, you're still unfolding this thing, right? It's not totally running at full speed right now. You've got, for the most part, all the pieces in play, and you're trucking along, and there are a lot of things evolving as you're growing your brand. So to that end, right, you've been involved with some other franchise groups, and you sat on their board, you've advised. In those scenarios, one of the things that I've seen franchisees come and go. I've seen locations shut down. That's like the worst thing for franchisors, knowing that you have locations shut down, and because you want your unit growth. And you're looking at this and you're going, how do I keep good franchisees? No different than the franchisee themselves wanting to keep good people and do their due diligence on having a proper interview and qualifying. How are you guys qualifying a franchisee that's coming in? Because to your point about growth and kind of this whole thing evolving and not having these metrics yet, you also are kind of putting together the playbook on looking for the right franchisees, so that way they stick for a long time. They do have a good product that matches exactly what you had laid out. So that way, if they do go sell, they have something that has some value, in the marketplace that they can sell, and they're not selling because someone's trying to sell off here, catch the knife. You want to be in a position where they're going, this is a great product, and it evolves into that new franchisee wanting to purchase more territory rights or more locations. So what are you guys doing to mitigate that? Because I know that there are groups, and I know you've been involved in some of them, and maybe that wasn't on the front end. Maybe they didn't have that stuff figured out early. Your 30-year tenure of watching this thing evolve has probably led to some of that mitigation, right? Where you're going, well, maybe we won't do it this way. We'll do it this way. So what are you guys doing today to vet the right franchisee?
Yeah. So one of the things we did early on, I think maybe the first 25 or so, locations were awarded by me personally. And then we signed on with what's called an FSO. Now that's just an acronym for a franchise sales organization. So basically it's a company that gives you bandwidth in the sales department. And they run a really tight sales process. So there is a lot to do to get to the final stage, which for us is Discovery Day, where we meet face to face, right? So it's everything from brand overview. There are financial qualifications, which are really important because being underfunded is the worst thing that can happen to you. So you have to meet certain financial criteria to qualify. You have to understand the brand. Got it. Go through unit economics, go through validation with other franchisees, go through marketing and ops. So you're going through probably 6 weeks of sales to get to that founders call that I talked about, where I meet with them, which is the gatekeeping call to get to, again, franchise discovery day, which is the last step in the process. And so when you're running a tight 6-week process, if any time in that process someone is not following process and they're missing appointments or they're showing up late, they will be washed out of the sales process. And so our sales team, though they want to sell, that's what they're there to do.
Right.
They have a lot of integrity, and they run, and salespeople sell, right? And they have a lot of integrity, and they run a really good sales process. So, a really good metric for us is when we get people to confirmation day or discovery day, our percentage of folks that get awarded is very high. They say yes because they really want to be there, because they've really had to work through this sort of, lengthy process that's not easy to get through. And then, we want them to be there because, typically that means really good quality candidates are showing up to that day that we get to meet in person. And then normally we both decide to move forward. So I think it sounds like an odd word, like our close rate, but it's more around, we're awarding people is, around 85%. So you can imagine 85% of the people that we ever meet end up moving forward together. We like them, they like us. Well, that's because there's a really tight process on the front end. I would say that that's very important, because choosing the wrong franchise partners will be the kiss of death, right? And I mentioned earlier, asking on those calls, like, what's your leadership background? What's your leadership experience? Then I say, listen, if you choose the wrong people, it's going to be a tough road to hoe. I want everybody on the call to nod, right? I'm like, I don't see you nodding, so-and-so. Oh, sorry. And I'm like, yes, I need you to understand. Like, I need to know that you understand that this is the crux move, right? Here's the assets we give you, bandwidth and help in this regard. But you have to sit down with someone and say, hey, come join me. Let's go change the lives of 130, 150 people in this community. And I need to know that you can do that. We often use this statement, are you the person you're looking for is looking for? And what I mean by that is, like, can I envision the person I'm talking to sitting down with what I know makes the ideal face of an alloy and saying, who's with me? And that person looking at them and being like, I can work with this person, right? So that's a big part of it. But having that really hard vetting 6-week process on the front end, there's plenty of candidates, Michael, that enter that process that don't, cross their T's and dot their I's. I never even get to talk to them, because, like, if they don't follow a process, they're washed out before they ever get to us. So that's a credit to, they're called the REPM group, REP, apostrophe M. They represent like 14, 15 brands now. And they're great. I mean, they do a fantastic job vetting really good candidates for us. And so we don't even have to mess with it. And when we meet them, they're usually pretty darn good. So that's how we do it. That really helps. And I would recommend, if you're not going to do that, definitely hire someone who can teach you a really solid sales process and make sure you stick to it, especially early on, because boy, you're going to be so excited to sell like anybody that has a pulse and has some money in their pocket, but it's a terrible idea. It will come back to bite you. And we've made that mistake on maybe one occasion where we didn't. And this is when I was selling on my own, and we weren't running as tight a process as we were later. And we awarded someone, and it was just a really bad idea. Now, thankfully, they sold to another franchisee that's doing well. But I wouldn't want to go through that again because you spend an inordinate amount of resources, time, and energy, on those struggling clubs. And it's kind of like the old NPS score, right? Net promoter
Yeah,
score,
yeah.
where if you're really low down, you're
Hmm.
probably not going to move up. You can take a mid-level performer and make them a great performer, but you can't take an absolute, someone who's really struggling and move them up. There's just too many things at play that make them that way, and you just can't overcome those. So, yeah, man, choose the right partners. We're in a tight sales process, and that's been super helpful for us.
Perfect. You just landed on what I wanted to ask you next, which was partnerships. So it, in I've been in business in a couple different facets of industry, a couple different verticals, not always just in fitness. And I've had some really great business partners, and I've had some really bad business partners, and not just bad in the way because it's like a marriage. I mean, you're going to be spending time with these people, and you go through this process. Now, there's two components to this. One is the business partners on the alloy side, like at the franchisor level, right? Because you're in partnership can mean a lot of different things. It could be you actually having partial ownership or them having partial ownership of the company or a subsection of the company. And then you have franchisees who you guys are selling to, and they have partners. And one of them could be a dog and just really slowing the whole process down, or making things hard for you guys as a franchisor, trying to give them the material they need. So how do you guys approach that as an organization internally? Do you have any partners? Have you worked with partners in the past where maybe you had to have an exit, or how do you plan for that? How do you have the right structure in place so that way it's clear and you don't run into a brick wall and go, well, that's not what I meant. What I meant was this is
Right.
what we talked about. Now you're saying something different, right? So how do you mitigate that?
We I've had the same business partner. She's a 20% owner in the overreaching enterprise. I've had her as a partner for 15 or so years, back from when we were licensing only. Um, And she's my partner now. And so we're lucky enough to have been well enough funded going into this where we did not have to look for friends and family round or
Mm-hmm.
VC money or something to start. Because if you do, it's all fine and dandy. And if you want to start out that way, and a lot of folks start out with mostly VC money and they're very well funded, and that can really help you grow. But if you do that, you have so little leverage early on, you're diluting yourself massively to take on an equity partner when you don't really have anything yet, right? So here's some interesting stats. So, if you get to 50 locations open, which we'll be at next month, you're in the top 15% of all franchises. And if you get 100 open, you're in the top 2%. We'll be at 100 open by like late fall, right? So
Wow.
a lot of activity. So that puts us in the top 2%. If you get to that point and you don't have any friends and family rounds or any VC, money early on, you're a literal unicorn. So it looks like, I mean, all indications are we'll get there, which is awesome. I don't know. I haven't personally experienced any hostile partnership situations in any of my history, but I've seen a lot of them, right? Now, I'll tell you what, so that's on the franchisor side. That's on our side. It's just one partner. We've worked together forever and things are great. And so that's been nice, clean, simple. Now, for the franchisee standpoint, if we get people that come to the table and there are more than two partners, we normally say no, first of all. And then if we are going to approve it, we meet with that group and we need to see a detailed operating agreement and we need commitments from who on who's doing what. Because
Mm-hmm.
before I got to franchising, and you've seen this a million times, Michael, I can't tell you how many times when we were licensing, when it didn't matter, as long as you were paying us,
Right.
you could take the license and
Right.
do what you wanted with it. It wasn't, the controls weren't in place. People would come to us and they have like four guys are going to open the gym. They're going to be equal partners, 25% each. And I would say, this is a terrible idea. Who's going to do what?
Mm-hmm.
And what if that guy doesn't do his job? What are you guys going to do? What's the buyout clause, right? It's just so many things. Like, what if there's a margin call and everybody has to put more money in? Does somebody get diluted? Like, and they're like, oh, normally they hadn't thought of it. It's just four
Yeah, they
guys
don't have
that
the
work
answer
out and
yet.
want to open a gym.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't have the answer. I'm like, you guys better get with an attorney and nail down a airtight operating agreement. This looks like a nightmare. And a lot of the times they're like, oh no, man, we're all good friends. It's going to be great. And then they move forward and then they all end up hating each other and not even friends
Yeah.
anymore. I'm like, I told you guys not to do that. So I would say on the franchisee side, having seen it happen so many times, we're very leery of it. We don't even allow it unless it is airtight operating agreement. We're really clear about who's doing what. And typically, Michael, that will come in the form of like there's an operating partner who's going to actually run the thing, and then there's an investment partner who's just investing the money but doesn't want to invest the time to run the business. And I don't mean like being in there servicing revenue. I mean just the person responsible for the business, meaning they're going to hold the managers and the trainers accountable, and they're responsible for the investment essentially. That we're fine with. But if you start adding a third, fourth person, like what are they even doing, right? And they all want to like put their hands in the pie. It's like, nah, that's going to get complicated, and that will hurt everyone, including us.
Are you guys doing franchises outside of the U.S. right now? Are you guys doing like master franchise deals in different countries? Canada,
We're not.
South America?
We've had people. No, not yet. Now we've done a lot of work in those other markets with licensing, so we have master franchise relationships, and we've had people that have reached out. It's just too early. There's so much runway left in the lower 48. Our goal is 800 locations by 2030, and by all indications, based on our current pace, we will get there much quicker.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going well. So why create any distraction from that? Now, I'm sure I'll be singing a different tune when we get another couple of years down the road and the flywheel's moving and, we've got 100, 200 locations open.
Right.
Sure. And obviously the obvious ones, you go to Canada, any English speaking countries, easy. We've got great contacts in Australia, New Zealand. So we've been contacted by those people already. It's just too early. So they're on our radar, but right now there's just too much work to be done right here in the lower 48 states.
Okay. And then the last question really is about the structure of your group, your small group. You call it small group, right? You don't call it semi-private.
Yeah, and it's nuance. And I think if you wanted to smell, feel, look like personal training, the nuance matters, right? Like we have T-shirts that say class. It's got a big circle around it with a slash through it, because like we jokingly corporately call that the C word. Like, do not use the word class, because class has a pricing and a service anchor that goes with it that we don't want to be associated with. We want to be associated with personal training, even in a one-on-one setting. We just want to be a better value proposition and more fun and accountability by being in a small group of people. But that's what we want to communicate. So it's definitely nuanced, right?
So with that, when you launch, okay, so you launch your semi-private or small group. When you're doing this, do you guys have a set number of groups or time blocks that you guys launch with? So it's like, we got a 5:30 or we got a 6 a.m. and then we've got another 7 a.m. and we don't do anything for a while. And then we've got a 11 or 12. How do you pick the right times? I'm assuming at this point, like, boom, these are the times that are the busiest.
Yeah. And so I'll back you right into the model, actually. So, a lot of people ask, how did you come up with that number 130, right? As like an ideal number. I'm like, well, it makes sense, like financially, obviously, but also you look at a moderate amount of hours. So again, this isn't like, we're not Chick-fil-A. You can be open on Sundays if you want. We just caution people not to create too much of an expense model. If how I remember clients are like, if you were on Sunday, I'd come in a fourth time or a third time. They don't. So it's like, just be careful, right, with the person that wants you to open at 4 a.m. And if you did, they'd come in, 3 times a week, and then they're not. And so our base hours that we built the model on are 6 to noon in the morning. You close down in the afternoon, and you come back and go 4 to 8 at night. So it's 2 shifts, right? That total hours is 10 hours. We do that, say, Monday through Friday. That's 50 hours. And then Saturday from 7 a.m. until noon. And that's it. So it's 55 hours a week. And then you take 55 hours a week. We can train up to 6 people per hour. We know that, everybody wants to build their performa based on an ideal situation where every session's booked with 6 people. And it's like, it doesn't work that way. It just never does, right? So let's base it on best case scenario, which would be 5 out of 6 of the sessions booked. So 83% roughly of the session times are booked, which means 5 out of 6 on average, that's great.
That's really
so
great.
If you did that, you took 55 hours, 83% like show rate, or saturation rate of the hours. Then you back your way into like, okay, we split the memberships about 50-50 across our brand between 2 days a week and 3 days a week. Two's enough, three's better. That's the idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then it's like, okay, well, that puts us at about 130 members, give or take. And that's a little bit more, but then we're even more conservative with that. That's how we come up with the 130 number. So there's certainly levers you can pull, Michael, that you understand. It's like we could be open at noon, and that gives us another
Right.
hour. You could be open longer on a Saturday, open on a Sunday. We just caution people against that. They can certainly choose to do so, but it's like, look, again, don't jump through hoops. Everyone says they'll come in early. Like if you open at 5, would you have a lot more members than you do now? And then you have to remember that that means now instead of some coach in your club or your director getting up at 4:30, to get to the gym and by 5:30 to do the pre-shift rituals and things that we have, systemized in place, they're getting up at 3:30. Well, that's a whole different deal. Like 3:30 in the morning is like middle of the night. Like
Yeah.
it's a weird dynamic. So you really have to think about the operational constraints for your team as well. And so that's why we built it on very conservative hours that are very doable. And it's nice, for the manager or the director, we call them, to manage those hours and to cover some Saturday shifts. And I mean, that's what it's based on, if that makes sense. And so
And,
that's how we backed our way into that number. And what I forgot to mention earlier when I was saying don't use the C word is, we don't call it semi-private. We use that term early on, but people didn't fully understand that. And then we were calling it small group personal training. But as you've probably seen, there's a lot of people that use small group training and
mm-hmm.
then, they don't have personal in there, but like they'll use small group
Right.
training. There's 20 people in there.
Right.
So it's like that gets confused. So we're always saying, look, it's personal training. And almost as a side note, in a small group. Again, we talk about the nuanced language around it and how we think about it. But like first and foremost, it's personal training, but we service it in a small group instead of small group training, which can be used a term for like anything. You can go to Lifetime Fitness and take small group training. There's 30 people in there. I'm like, okay.
Right.
I mean, what's a small group, right? It's a relative term.
Right. Yeah. It depends on how many total people are there. And that brings me to the, a lot of these gyms, the way they operate, right? I've had gyms of my own, and your goal is to get as many members as you can, knowing that a small percentage of them are actually going to use the facility and beat your equipment up. And if you had everybody show up, you'd be replacing your equipment every year, maybe sooner. So your focus is to get 130 members and have all 130 members training on a regular basis. Are you going to have 200 people sign up and there's a percentage of them? Is there a percentage of them that just don't show? They pay, but they're not coming.
There is. It's a lot smaller, as you can imagine. You'll have some low usage and not many non-usage because the price threshold, and this is a good thing, like this is the psychology of pricing, right? Where if I'm paying you $400 a month, I'm probably going to show up for that workout. If I'm paying you, 9 up to 30, maybe $50 a month, like depending on who you are and what your financial, situation is, I might leave that out there for a while, and it's not going to bother me a bit if I don't show up. It's like, whatever,
Right.
I just feel good that I've got a membership and I can tell myself that come Monday I might start working out.
Yeah.
Right? It's worth that. It's worth the lie I can tell myself every week, or the hope. But for us, it's enough of a disturbance to get people to use it, and I think that's a good thing through the lens of accountability, which is what a big part of what a personal trainer does.
Mm-hmm.
I can distinctly remember a conversation around that, where we had a member. At one point, we made a mistake, like 15 years ago, and we were offering an unlimited membership for small group personal training, which made it easy to sell. But like either somebody would actually take advantage of that and start coming in every day, which we would not recommend just physiologically, or they would buy it and then there was no accountability, right? There was no like there was a carrot, which was come in and get in shape, but there was no stick. Meaning, one of the great things about session-based training, like 2 or 3 days a week, is if you don't come in, you lose your session. So like a lot of people are like, I'm not losing my damn session off. Well, if that's enough to get you out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning, then we're going to use it, right? I could distinctly remember when we had unlimited, though, we didn't have the stick. And so we came up with a late charge fee because we needed something to get people there. And we had a guy, and he was 3 days a week, and boy, he was canceling all the time. And he was probably averaging 4 to 6 times a month. And he was racking up all kinds of late, cancellation fees.
Yeah.
And so imagine he's paying $450 a month or something, and then he gets another charge on his card for another $200-300.
Yeah,
he was not
pissed.
happy, and he had financial means. He just didn't like it. And he came in, sat down, meet with our director, and our director just didn't even give him a chance to get started and said, listen, before we get into this transactional conversation, where have you been? Like, you made a commitment to me that you're going to work out 3 days a week. I'm calling you. I'm doing everything I can to keep you accountable. And you're still only showing up 4 to 6 times a month. So before you get upset with me, why are you not coming in? And he's like, oh, I'm busy with travel. And he's like, well, I've always had that. So like, you still said you could come in and now you're not. That's a commitment you made. This is about your fitness. And he's like, listen, these late fees, we're not Blockbuster. That's not like a revenue source for us, right? As a matter of fact, we'll donate it to charity if you want. It's a mechanism to get you to show up. And he's like, this guy was like entrepreneur of the year, through Entrepreneur Magazine. This guy was a stud. So he's doing well financially. And so he said, listen, apparently, the late fee, I think it was like $25 or something. That's not enough to get you out of bed. So why don't you tell me, write down on this piece of paper, how much I need to charge you so that you would wake up no matter what and get here? Like, is it $1,000? Is it $20,000? I don't know what your financial situation is, but give me a number that would make you show up, that it would disturb you enough that you wouldn't come in. And then I'll donate all of that money to charity so that you won't think we're trying to pocket that. And he was like, ugh, then he got it. And then he apologized. Then he started coming in 3 days a week, and lo and behold, he got in great shape, and then thanked our director for that really difficult conversation. But I think that's what we're trying to do as a brand, and that's a harsh story, but like, that's what we're trying to do as a brand. And I think in that environment, we're not going to have a lot of low or non-users. And part of it is the price. And I like the high price because that's going to make people feel disturbed enough to use it. And if they use it, they're going to get what they want, which is they're going to get in great shape. So that's our philosophy on it overall.
Rick, I really appreciate you being on again. I want people to that are listening, I want you to find out what Rick's doing, because his business is growing fast. If you don't get in now, you might miss the train. Okay. Because there's opportunities right now for you to get in, probably at a lower price as a franchisor as a franchisee, as this thing starts to take off. Because I know from experience working with some of these franchise groups, as demand increases, naturally the price has to go up, because they've got to weed out some of those non-performers that are wanting to get in. So, take a look at what he's doing. If you're thinking about running your own program, there's a reason why he's put all this stuff together. As he spent 30 years, or you spent 30 plus years actually working on this, Rick, and you have the systems in place. You can go out and do the same thing, but just, take the credit that he's already put together and put this stuff together for you, and take a look at it. Rick, I really appreciate you being on again today, and looking forward to getting to shake your hand and be there in person. I know I was hoping to do that this show so we can have it right there at your corporate office. You've been busy though, so, and rightly so.
Yeah, I really look forward to that. Listen, Michael, I've heard nothing but great things, and obviously we know each other's history, so I'm always honored to be on. Thanks for having me back, and I do look forward to meeting you in person. We'll have you up to the office, and we'll get you on our podcast. We can sit down together and
awesome.
Have a coffee or some whiskey or both, or whatever you want to do, and just talk shop. I would love that.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Rick. Thanks so much.